The candlelight flickered softly against the glass of expensive champagne flutes, casting golden reflections onto the polished marble floors. The room smelled of roses and vanilla, a scent she had come to associate with love, with happiness. With him. She turned to her husband, her heart full. He was everything she had ever dreamed of, tall, handsome, with a quiet intensity in his gaze that made her feel like the only woman in the world. He had chosen her. Out of everyone, he had chosen her. Or so she thought. That night, nestled in the warmth of their marital bed, she stirred awake to the sound of his voice, soft, almost desperate. A name, but not hers. Her breath hitched as she turned to him, watching the way his lips moved in sleep, murmuring over and over again. Her sister's name. A cold weight settled in her chest, crushing, suffocating. Surely, she had misheard. But then, as if twisting a knife into an open wound, he sighed, his voice thick with longing. I love you. The name followed like a whispered prayer, a cruel confirmation. She sat up abruptly, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her heart begged for an explanation, but dread had already settled in, heavy and undeniable. Slowly, she reached out and shook his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding them before recognition set in. What's wrong? His voice was groggy, laced with sleep. She hesitated. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe. But no. She had to know. She swallowed hard. You were saying something in your sleep. His expression remained blank. What did I say? Her fingers curled into the sheets. You said my sister's name. The silence that followed stretched painfully between them. He didn't deny it. Didn't even flinch. Just stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Something inside her cracked. Tell me I misheard, she whispered. He exhaled slowly, sitting up. And then, with a chilling calmness that shattered every illusion she had ever held, he spoke the words that would change everything. I didn't marry you for you. Her breath left her in a sharp, painful rush. He looked at her then, eyes empty, as if she were nothing more than a mistake. I married you because I thought you were her. The world tilted. The room blurred. And in that moment, she realized the truth. She was nothing but a replacement. The silence after his words was deafening. She stared at him, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. He didn't even try to take it back. Didn't stutter. Didn't apologize. Just cold, undeniable truth. She felt her lips part, but no words came out. What could she even say? Her fingers trembled as she clutched the sheets beneath her. You, her voice barely came out. You thought I was her? His jaw tightened. He ran a hand through his hair, as if this conversation was nothing more than an inconvenience. I thought I was marrying your sister, he admitted. I wanted her. I always have. Her stomach twisted violently. Then why? She rejected me. He cut her off, his voice sharp, void of any guilt. And you, he exhaled, meeting her gaze for the first time with something close to disdain. You looked so much like her. The way you smiled, the way you spoke, it was easy to pretend. Easy to pretend. Her entire world crumbled with those 3 words. She felt sick. The man she had given everything to, the man she thought loved her, had only ever been looking at a shadow of someone else. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. When were you planning to tell me? She asked, her voice eerily calm. I wasn't. That broke something inside her. The lump in her throat threatened to choke her. She had loved him blindly, desperately. She had thought their love was real. But it had never been love, not for him. Just a mistake. Just a lie. She sucked in a breath, willing herself not to break in front of him. Did you ever love me? His silence was answer enough. She felt something inside her snap. Not just heartbreak, but something deeper. Something colder. She climbed out of bed, ignoring the way her legs shook beneath her. Where are you going? He asked, watching her carefully. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. I may look like my sister, but I'm not her. Something flickered in his gaze. Something unreadable. I won't beg for love that was never mine, she said, her voice steady now. But you'll regret this. He scoffed. Regret what? She met his eyes, and this time, it wasn't heartbreak that filled her. It was something sharper. You'll see. She grabbed her coat and walked out of the room. Out of the house. Out of the life she had thought was hers. And she knew exactly where she was going. To her sister. To tell her everything. To begin his downfall. The night air was cold, but she barely felt it. Her fingers clenched around her phone as she walked, her mind replaying every single moment of her marriage. Every whispered, I love you. Every lingering touch. Every time she had looked into his eyes and thought he saw her. It had all been a lie. She sucked in a sharp breath, forcing back the rage burning in her veins. No, she wouldn't cry. Not anymore. She pressed the call button. The phone rang once. Twice. Then, hello. The voice on the other end was warm, familiar. It belonged to the woman he had truly loved. Her sister. I need to see you, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. A pause. Then, come over. She was already on her way. An hour later, at her sister's apartment. The moment the door opened, she felt her composure slip just a little. Her twin stood there, concern etched on her face. What's wrong? For a moment, she couldn't speak. Looking at her sister was like looking at her own reflection. Same face, same eyes. But they weren't the same. They never had been. Her sister had been wanted. She had been chosen. And she had only been an illusion. She stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. Then, in a quiet, almost broken voice, she whispered, He never loved me. Her sister's eyes widened. What are you talking about? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay strong. He thought I was you. The words left her lips like poison. She expected disbelief, shock, maybe even guilt. But what she didn't expect was the fire that flickered in her sister's gaze. Tell me everything, her sister said, her voice sharp. And so she did. Every painful detail. The wedding built on a lie. The way he had whispered her sister's name in his sleep. The cold, emotionless way he had admitted the truth. When she was done, her sister exhaled slowly. So he used you, her sister murmured. She nodded. And now, I want him to pay. Silence stretched between them. Then her sister's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Then let's make him suffer. A plan was forming. One that would turn his obsession into his destruction. Her sister poured 2 glasses of wine, sliding one across the table. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, shared pain, and something darker. Something neither of them had ever truly embraced. Revenge. So, her sister said, swirling her wine, you want to destroy him? She didn't hesitate. Yes. Her sister studied her carefully, then leaned forward. Good. Because so do I. She blinked. You do. Her sister exhaled. He pursued me for months. Always watching, always following. I thought he was just persistent. But something about the way he looked at me, it was obsessive. Unhealthy. Her fingers tightened around the glass. So I rejected him. I never thought he'd go as far as to marry my twin just to hold on to some fantasy. Her stomach twisted, but she pushed the pain down. Then let's make sure he never gets what he wants again. A slow, knowing smile spread across her sister's face. And I know exactly how to do that. The plan was simple. They would switch places. For the first time in their lives, they would become each other. And he would never see it coming. Step 1. The transformation. She sat on the stool in front of the mirror as her sister worked, adjusting the way she did her hair, teaching her the subtle mannerisms that made them different. The way I walk is more confident, her sister explained, demonstrating. You hesitate a little, like you're afraid of taking up space. That has to change. She mimicked her sister's steps, learning the rhythm, the control. Good, her sister praised. Now, the way I speak. I don't soften my voice like you do. I make people listen. She practiced, repeating the words until even she believed she sounded like her sister. And the final touch, her sister murmured, reaching for a shade of lipstick she never wore. She applied it slowly, precisely. "You always go for soft pinks." "I don't." She stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was no longer the forgotten twin. She was the one he had wanted all along. "Perfect," her sister whispered. Step 2, the first move. That evening, she returned home. The key turned in the lock, and as she stepped inside, she felt different. She wasn't the heartbroken wife anymore. She was the woman he had chased for years. She heard footsteps approaching. He must have heard the door. Then there he was. He stood there in the dim light, his gaze cautious. "You're back." She tilted her head slightly, letting a slow, knowing smile play on her lips, just like her sister would. "Did you miss me?" she purred. His eyes darkened. She saw it, the flicker of something dangerous, something possessive. He thought he had lost her. And now he thought he was getting her back. Fool. He had no idea he was about to lose everything. His eyes were glued to her, scanning her face, searching for something, doubt, regret, hesitation. But she gave him nothing. She stood tall, her posture confident, her expression unreadable. She could see it in his gaze, the hunger, the obsession creeping back in. "You seem different," he murmured, stepping closer. She met his stare, unwavering. "Do I?" His lips parted slightly, like he wanted to say more, but something about her presence kept him on edge. Good. Let him feel the shift. Let him wonder. "Did you think I'd fall apart?" she asked, tilting her head just enough to make him question everything. "That I'd beg you to love me?" His jaw tightened, as if he didn't like the accusation. "I never said that. But that's what you expected, didn't you?" She took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. Her voice dipped into something lower, something dangerously close to the way her sister spoke. "What if I told you I'm done pretending?" His fingers twitched at his sides. He didn't like losing control. And that was exactly why she was going to take it from him. She reached out, letting her fingers graze his shirt collar, watching the way his breath hitched. So subtle, but she noticed. "Tell me, husband," she whispered, her lips curling into a taunting smile. "Are you finally seeing me now?" His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. She saw it, the moment doubt slipped into his features. Because the woman standing before him was no longer the fool he had married. She was the woman he had always wanted. Or so he thought. Step 3, the game begins. The next morning, she moved through the house like she owned it. Because she did. He watched her closely as she sipped her coffee, his brows furrowing like he was still trying to solve the puzzle she had become overnight. "Did something happen?" he finally asked. She took another sip, deliberately slow, then set the cup down. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You're different." She smirked. "Is that a bad thing?" A muscle in his jaw ticked. No, he didn't hate it. He liked it. And that was his biggest mistake. Because she was leading this dance now. And step by step, she was going to make sure he never recovered from it. He wasn't sure when it started, the chase. One moment, he had been standing at the top, looking down at her, convinced he had everything under control. Now, she was slipping through his fingers. She was in the house, in his presence, but he could feel the distance growing. And it drove him insane. At first, he tried to ignore it. The way she no longer asked for his attention. The way she moved with quiet confidence, as if she didn't need him, didn't care for his presence at all.
It wasn't supposed to be this way.
She was supposed to be the one desperate for his love. But now, he was the one watching her, studying her, craving something he couldn't name. And she knew it. Every morning, she left for somewhere, dressed in confidence and a hint of mystery, giving him nothing but a fleeting smile before walking out the door. She didn't ask where he was going, didn't wait for him to come home, didn't even care if he did. And that drove him mad. One evening, he found himself waiting for her. He had never done that before. When she finally walked in, heels clicking against the floor, she barely spared him a glance. He clenched his fists. Where were you? She raised an eyebrow. Since when do you ask? His patience thinned. You're my wife. Something flickered in her gaze, something sharp and amused. You're right, she murmured, stepping closer, tilting her head like she was studying a stranger. I am your wife. He swallowed hard. There was something unsettling about the way she said it. Then, just as quickly, she turned away, heading upstairs without another word. The air between them was shifting. He could feel it, and for the first time, he didn't like being the one left behind. The next day, he found himself watching her. The way she carried herself. The way she spoke. The way she no longer hesitated, no longer sought his approval. And worst of all, the way she didn't need him. For years, he had convinced himself that she was nothing more than a placeholder. A mistake. A means to an end. But now the mistake was his. Because he had let her slip into something he couldn't control. And for the first time, he found himself asking a dangerous question. Had he ever really wanted her sister at all? Or had he just never seen the woman in front of him? The unraveling had begun. He could feel it in the way his thoughts twisted, tangled, obsessed. Her scent lingered in the air long after she left a room. Her laughter, light, distant, no longer his, echoed in his mind. And the worst part? She didn't care. He was losing her. And he didn't even know when he started wanting to keep her. Who was that man? She blinked, caught off guard by his sudden outburst. What? Don't play games with me. His jaw was clenched, his fists tight at his sides. The man who dropped you off just now. Who is he? She let out a soft, amused laugh. Are you jealous? He stiffened. Was he?
No.
Impossible. That wasn't what this was. This was control. This was his wife slipping through his fingers.
His.
She stepped closer, her perfume wrapping around him like a dangerous spell. You didn't care before, she murmured. Why now? He had no answer. Because the truth was suffocating. He wasn't chasing her because she was his wife. He was chasing her because she was no longer chasing him. That night, he heard her on the phone. Soft voice. A quiet chuckle. Not for him. Never for him anymore. He stood in the doorway, unseen, listening. I had a wonderful time today, she said. Maybe next time, you can take me somewhere even better? A cold fury wrapped around his chest. He took a step forward, pushing the door open just enough for her to notice. She turned slowly, phone still in hand, a flicker of knowing amusement in her eyes.
Who was that? He demanded.
She raised an eyebrow. Someone who actually sees me. His stomach twisted. His world tilted. He had seen her. Hadn't he? Hadn't he? But maybe, just maybe, he had been blind all along. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in his life, he ached. And it was all for a woman he once thought was disposable. But now, she was slipping away. And he was the fool who had let it happen. He couldn't escape it anymore.
The ache.
The longing. The realization that had come too late. She was gone. Not physically, she was still in the house, still moving in and out of his life like a ghost. But her presence, her warmth, her love, all of it had vanished. And now, for the first time, he was the one left behind. He found himself watching her again. Every smile she gave to someone else. Every whisper of laughter that wasn't meant for him. It drove him mad. One evening, when she moved to leave for another one of her mysterious outings, he finally snapped. Don't go. She paused at the door, turning slightly. Excuse me? His pulse pounded. He wasn't used to asking for things, he was used to taking, owning. But now, he was at her mercy. I said don't go, he repeated, voice quieter, raw. Stay. She tilted her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. And why would I do that? He swallowed hard. Because I can't bear it anymore. Because I'm losing you. Because I was a fool and I don't know how to fix this. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he gritted his teeth and tried one last time.
Please.
The word felt foreign on his tongue. She stared at him, something unreadable in her expression. Then, slowly, she stepped closer until she was just within reach. Her lips parted, like she might say something, like she might stay. His breath caught. But then she smiled. And it wasn't the smile of a woman who had been won over. It was the smile of a woman who had already won. "Not tonight, darling," she murmured, brushing past him. The door clicked shut behind her. And for the first time in his life, he was the one left standing alone. That night, he made a decision. He wouldn't let her go. Not without a fight. Because somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love with the woman he never truly saw.
And now?
He would do whatever it took to make her stay, even if he had to beg. Panic was a foreign feeling to him. He had spent his life believing he was always in control, always the one holding the strings. But now, the strings were slipping through his fingers. And for the first time in his life, he was afraid. He waited for her that night, sat in the dim glow of the living room, hands clasped, jaw tight, a storm raging in his chest. When the door finally opened and she stepped inside, his heart slammed against his ribs. She barely spared him a glance as she moved past him, like he was nothing, like he didn't matter. "Where were you?" His voice was hoarse, rough with something he didn't want to name. She didn't stop.
Out.
With him. She paused at that, turning slightly, her expression unreadable. "Why do you care?" His fingers curled into fists. "Because I can't breathe without you anymore." But the words stayed lodged in his throat, too bitter, too raw. She tilted her head, studying him, and then she laughed.
Soft.
Mocking. "Look at you," she murmured, stepping closer. "Isn't it funny? The man who once threw me away is now the one chasing after me." His pulse pounded. "I never threw you away," he said through clenched teeth. "Didn't you?" Her voice was quiet, but each word cut. "You married me for her. You looked at me and saw someone else. You loved her, not me. And now that I've stopped caring, suddenly you do." A bitter silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, she shook her head, her smile fading. "You don't get to do this," she whispered. And that was it. The breaking point. The moment when his pride, his ego, his carefully built walls, all of it crumbled. He surged forward, his hand catching her wrist before she could walk away. She stiffened, but he didn't let go. "You're right," he rasped. "I didn't see you. I was blind."
Stupid.
"I thought I wanted her. But I didn't. I never did." Her breath hitched. His grip tightened, desperation clawing at him. "I see you now." She swallowed, her eyes flickering with something dangerous. And then softly she asked, "Do you?" He nodded. "Yes." Her lips curled into the faintest, most unreadable smile. And then she leaned in, whispering the words that shattered him completely. "Then prove it. He has confessed, but words are not enough. Now she will make him prove it. And for the first time in his life, he will have to fight for her." He thought it would be easy. Winning her back. Proving himself. Fixing what he had broken. But nothing about her was easy anymore. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't cling to him, like she once had. She only watched. Waited. And with every day that passed, he realized how deep his mistake had truly been. She had become a ghost in his life. She still lived in the same house. Ate at the same table. Slept on the same bed. But not with him. Not for him. Every time he reached for her, she stepped away. Every time he spoke her name, she smiled, but it was distant, polite. Like he was a stranger. And maybe that's what he had become. To her, he was no longer a husband. No longer a man she loved. Just someone she once knew. It was raining. She stood outside, watching the storm, her arms wrapped around herself. He approached carefully, as if she were something fragile. Something that would disappear if he came too close. She didn't turn when he stopped beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, he whispered, "Do you still love me?" The question hung between them, heavy and raw. The rain fell harder. She exhaled softly, closing her eyes. "Love isn't the problem." His breath hitched.
Hope.
There was still hope. "I love you," he admitted, the words breaking from his chest. "I love you, and I was a fool. I spent so much time chasing a fantasy that I ignored the real thing.
You.
The woman in front of me. And now He stopped, his voice choking. Because she was looking at him. For the first time in so long, really looking at him. And then, softly, she asked, "If you love me, then let me go." His world stopped. "Let you go?" His voice cracked. She nodded, sadness flickering in her eyes. "You only want me now because you're losing me. But if you truly love me, then let me make the choice for myself." His hands clenched into fists. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. If he begged, if he forced her to stay, he would never truly have her. But if he let her go, if he let her choose, he might lose her forever. The next morning, she found an envelope on the bedside table. Inside was a single piece of paper. Divorce papers. And, at the bottom, his signature. Her hands trembled as she read the note tucked inside. "I love you. Enough to let you go. But I will wait, for as long as it takes." Tears burned her eyes. Because for the first time, he had finally chosen her. Not by chasing, not by forcing, but by trusting. 6 months later, he sat at the cafe where they first met. Waiting, hoping, and just as he was about to give up, a shadow fell across the table. He looked up, and there she was.
Smiling.
Choosing him. Again. This time for real.